In this video, we'll analyze the behavior of some rules that will help you simplify the development of your application. Let's start with the add rule. To understand how this rule works, suppose that a customer earns miles for each tour purchased. Every time a tour is added for a customer, the miles corresponding to that tour must be added to the customer total miles attribute, which contains the total miles earned by that customer. To do so, we'll use the add rule. But what happens if, after doing this, the client cancels a tour? In that case, the add rule automatically subtracts the number of miles of the tour that's being deleted from the customer's total miles. And what if the number of miles awarded when taking a tour is modified? That is to say, the customer trip miles attribute. The rule subtracts the value of the miles associated with the tour from the customer's total number of miles, and then adds the new value, so that the information is up to date. In short, this rule adjusts its behavior depending on how the transaction is being used. When inserting data, the value of the first attribute is added to the second one. When deleting data, the value of the first attribute is subtracted from the second one. And when changing data, the difference between the new value and the old value of the first attribute is added to the value of the second one. Perhaps the most natural thing in this case would have been to use a sum formula, which would avoid all this. But what if we don't always want the miles to be calculated according to this sum? What if we wanted to be able to increase the customer's miles according to some other criteria? For example, because we want to give VIP customers miles as a gift from time to time. In this case, we need the customer's miles to be a stored attribute, which, although it's calculated by adding up the miles of each trip, it can also be modified by other means. In the chapter on formulas, we'll study in more detail the difference between the sum formula and the add rule. Now let's move on to the subtract rule, which has a similar behavior to the add rule. We have a prize transaction that allows us to define rewards to be redeemed for miles. Each reward has a number of miles required to make the redemption. So when trying to assign a reward to a customer, you must first confirm that the customer's miles are enough for the exchange. If they are enough and the reward is taken, the miles redeemed must be subtracted. Otherwise, an error message must be displayed. To this end, we'll define these rules in the prize transaction. Since both involve the customer total miles attribute, with one rule updating the attribute and the other rule evaluating its value, Genexus determines that it must first execute the subtraction that updates the customer total miles attribute, and then evaluate what happened to its value. Since the subtraction is made first, if the customer had fewer miles than those required by the reward, the customer total miles attribute will end up with a negative value. This is why the error rule evaluates whether the customer total miles is less than 0. If this happens, the error rule is triggered with the message that indicates it, and the subtract rule operation is undone. That is, its execution is reversed as if it had not been done, and the client's total miles remains unchanged. If, on the other hand, customer total miles did not end up with a negative value, the subtract operation was carried out, and the reward was associated with the customer whose total number of miles decreased. All this provided, of course, that the user confirms it on the screen. Otherwise, this will only have been done in memory and nothing will be saved in the database. But what happens if, after redeeming a reward, the customer changes his mind and wants to return it? In this case, the subtract rule adds the number of miles redeemed for the reward to the customer's total number of miles. What if the value associated with the number of miles corresponding to a reward is modified? That is, the prize miles attribute. Its previous value is automatically added to the customer's total miles, and then the new value is subtracted. In short, the subtract rule works in the opposite way to the add rule. When inserting data, the value of the first attribute is subtracted from the second one. When deleting data, the value of the first attribute is added to the second one. And when making changes, the difference between the new value and the old value of the first attribute is subtracted from the value of the second one. There are other very interesting rules that you can explore. For example, the update rule, which allows you to modify the values of the attributes inferred from a transaction, updating them in their corresponding tables. The ref message rule, which allows changing the default messages displayed by Genexus when a certain referential integrity check fails. The prompt rule, which allows changing the prompt or default selection list for each foreign key. The color rule, which allows using colors to quickly improve the application's appearance. And there are many others that you can get to know through the Insert a Rule dialog. We encourage you to discover its uses in the Genexus Wiki.